I had always imagined my wedding day would be perfect. The kind of day little girls dream about: white lace, gentle music, the love of my life standing at the altar with tears in his eyes as I walked toward him. And for a while it was exactly that. The morning had been a blur of laughter and last-minute preparations. My bridesmaids surrounded me, fussing over my hair, my dress, my nerves. My mother, of course, had been her usual self, demanding perfection at every turn. "Straighten the hem," she muttered to the seamstress. "Fix the flowers, they're too close together," she scolded the planner. It was exhausting, but I had learned long ago that this was her way of showing love. She had never liked Matthew. Not from the very beginning. It wasn't that he had ever done anything wrong. He was kind, thoughtful, successful in his own quiet way. But he wasn't what she had envisioned for me. He wasn't from a distinguished family, as she put it. He didn't have a lineage that traced back to social clubs and charity galas. My mother, despite all her elegant charm, had always been obsessed with appearances. "You're making a mistake, darling," she had told me just days before the wedding, her voice soft but edged with warning. "You can still walk away." I had laughed then, dismissing her concerns as the usual overprotectiveness. I loved Matthew. That was all that mattered. Or so I thought. As I stood at the doors of the grand cathedral, my heart pounded with nervous excitement. The music swelled, and the double doors slowly opened. Every guest turned to look at me, their faces glowing with expectation. And at the far end of the aisle Matthew stood, his eyes locked onto mine, his expression filled with nothing but love. I took a deep breath, ready to step forward. And then my mother spoke. Her voice rang through the cathedral, cold and unyielding. "This wedding will not happen." Gasps rippled through the room. A murmur of confusion spread like wildfire. My feet were frozen to the spot, my bouquet trembling in my hands. I turned to look at her, standing just behind me, her face composed, her eyes burning with quiet determination. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" And then, in front of everyone I loved, my mother revealed the secret she had been holding on to. The secret that would change everything. For a moment the entire church stood in stunned silence. The music had stopped, the guests were frozen, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then the whispers started. I turned to face my mother, my voice shaking. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, eyes scanning the room as if daring someone to challenge her. "I will not let you marry him, Claire," she said firmly. "Not when I know the truth." I glanced at Matthew, my Matthew, standing at the altar, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. I wanted to run to him, to make this stop, to pretend that whatever was happening wasn't real. "What truth?" I demanded, my fingers gripping my bouquet so tightly the stems threatened to snap. My mother exhaled slowly and turned toward the crowd. "I didn't want to do this in front of everyone, but you left me no choice," she said, her voice measured, composed. Then she looked at Matthew and her gaze was ice. "Tell her, Matthew. Tell her who you really are." A collective gasp went through the guests. My stomach dropped. Matthew's face paled, his hands clenched into fists. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. But I knew that look. That hesitation. The way his throat bobbed when he swallowed hard. Panic bloomed in my chest. "Matthew," I whispered, searching his face. "What is she talking about?" My mother gave him a pointed look, then turned back to me. "He's been lying to you, Claire. About his past. About his name. About everything." I shook my head. "That's impossible. I know him better than anyone." She tilted her head. "Do you?" A hush settled over the church, all eyes darting between us. My hands trembled. I had known Matthew for years. We had built a life together, dreams together. What could she possibly mean? "You're lying," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She sighed, as if I were a child who had just refused to eat my vegetables. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. "I hired a private investigator, Claire," she said, handing it to me. My fingers fumbled as I unfolded the papers. And then the words jumped out at me. So stark, so foreign, so shattering that my breath caught in my throat. I felt the blood drain from my face. My knees nearly gave out. "Tell me it's not true," I whispered, staring at Matthew, the man I loved, the man I thought I knew. But he said nothing. because the truth was right there in front of me. And suddenly my mother wasn't the villain. She was the only one who had seen the storm coming. The paper trembled in my hands as I read the words over and over, my mind refusing to accept them. The neatly printed text, the official stamps, every detail was sharp and undeniable. Matthew Carter doesn't exist. The man I had planned to marry, the man I had loved with every fiber of my being, had lied to me about something so fundamental it made my head spin. I forced myself to look up at him. Say something, I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's lips parted, but no words came. The silence was deafening. The guests had stopped whispering. Now they simply stared. My bridesmaids stood frozen near the altar, unsure whether to rush to my side or pretend they hadn't witnessed this train wreck of a wedding. My mother, standing tall beside me, exhaled softly. "Claire," she said gently, "I know this is a shock, but I needed you to know before it was too late." Too late. The word stung. I looked at Matthew again, searching for the man I knew, the man I had trusted. But now all I saw was a stranger in a tuxedo. "Claire, I can explain," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Then do it." I shot back, my composure slipping. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're not who you said you were." His jaw tightened. He glanced around the church as if trying to decide whether to tell me the truth here, in front of everyone, or to beg me to leave with him so we could talk in private. But I wasn't moving. Not now. Not after this. My mother placed a hand on my arm. "Matthew, if you care about my daughter at all, you will be honest with her," she said, her voice steady. "Tell her why you changed your name. Tell her what you're hiding." I heard a sharp intake of breath from Matthew, and in that moment I knew he had never planned on telling me the truth. The realization burned. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Matthew, is your name even Matthew?" I asked. His hesitation was all the answer I needed. A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Tears pricked at my eyes. "Then who are you?" Matthew swallowed hard. "Claire, please. Not like this." But it was already too late. My mother stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Your real name is Daniel Grayson, isn't it?" A cold wave washed over me. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Not yet. Matthew Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second before opening them again. And when he did, the look in them wasn't the one I had fallen in love with. It was the look of a man who had been caught. The name echoed in my mind, foreign yet unsettlingly familiar. Daniel Grayson. I searched Matthew, no Daniel's face, desperate for a sign that this was all some horrible mistake. That my mother had somehow been wrong, that this was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But his expression, tight-lipped, shoulders squared, told me everything I needed to know. I had never known the man standing in front of me. A murmur rippled through the guests, the sound swelling like a rising tide. "Daniel Grayson," someone whispered. "Where have I heard that name before?" And then from the back of the room, a sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Oh my God. Wasn't he in the news a few years ago?" My breath caught. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," she said. "He was." I turned to her, my hands shaking. "Mom, what is this?" She exhaled slowly, as if preparing herself for something terrible. "Claire," she said carefully, "Daniel Grayson wasn't just lying about his name. He was involved in something serious. Something dangerous." I shook my head. No, that's not possible." Daniel Matthew, whatever his name was, took a step forward. "Claire, don't listen to them. Please," he pleaded. "I can explain." I took a step back. "Then explain," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "Right now." His hands clenched at his sides. "It's complicated. Complicated." That was all he had to say? I felt sick. The name Daniel Grayson still danced in my mind, an unsolved puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Until suddenly it did. A memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought of in years. I had been scrolling through news articles late one night, a true crime piece catching my attention. A financial scandal, something about fraud, missing money, disappearing without a trace. My heart stopped. "You stole money," I whispered. A hush fell over the church. Daniel's face paled. "Claire." I covered my mouth with my hand, as if I could shove the words back in. "It's true, isn't it?" His silence was deafening. A cold weight settled in my chest. My fiancé, the man I had trusted, the man I was about to vow my life to, was a fraud in more ways than one. And my mother had known all along. I stood there, gripping my bouquet like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My head was spinning, my heart racing. The man I loved had just been unmasked in front of everyone. And worse, he wasn't denying it. Daniel Grayson. Sounded so wrong, so foreign. My whole life with him, our dates, our long walks, our late-night talks, felt like a carefully scripted lie. The gasps and murmurs among the guests grew louder. I could feel their eyes burning into me, waiting to see what I would do next. "Claire," Daniel pleaded, stepping closer. His voice was strained, desperate. "Please. I can explain everything." I wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could have done this to me, to us. But my mother spoke first. "Then explain," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Tell my daughter what you've been hiding." Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the room. He looked like a trapped animal. For the first time since meeting him, I was afraid of him. "Mom," I croaked, barely able to find my voice. "Tell me everything." She nodded, taking a deep breath. 2 years ago, Daniel Grayson, under his real name, was a high-ranking financial officer at a large investment firm, she said, turning to face the guests as if she were presenting a case in court. He was accused of embezzling millions from his clients. Money vanished. Accounts were drained. And right before the company could build a case against him, he disappeared. The authorities never found him. Until now. A stunned silence fell over the church. I couldn't breathe. I turned to Daniel, the man who had shared my bed, my secrets, my dreams, and found a stranger staring back at me. "Is it true?" I choked out. "Did you do it?" His eyes searched mine, and for the briefest moment I saw something there. Regret. "Claire," he murmured. "I never meant for this to happen. For you to get caught up in any of this." "That's not an answer." I snapped, my voice rising. "Did you steal the money or not?" He hesitated. And then he whispered, "Yes." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The room swayed and someone, maybe one of my bridesmaids, rushed forward to steady me, but I jerked away. Daniel took another step toward me. "Claire, listen to me," he begged. "It wasn't what it seems. I had no choice." "No choice," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You had a choice every day to tell me the truth. And instead, you let me fall in love with someone who doesn't even exist." He flinched, but I didn't stop. "Did you ever love me?" I demanded. "Of course I did," he said quickly. "I still do. Claire, everything between us was real. I changed my name, yes, but I never lied about the way I felt about you. How can I believe anything you say?" I whispered, tears burning in my eyes. The man I had built my future with wasn't real. He was a con artist. My mother stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "Claire, listen to me. You don't have to do this. You don't have to marry him. You don't have to let him drag you down with him." Daniel turned to her, his expression darkening. "Stay out of this," he warned. But she didn't even flinch. "You've already done enough damage." The tension in the room was unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked horrified, others fascinated, like they were watching a live crime drama unfold before their eyes. Finally, I made my decision. With trembling fingers, I reached up and pulled the engagement ring off my hand. I held it out in front of me, my heart shattering into pieces. "Take it," I said quietly. Daniel stared at me. "Claire, please. Take it." My voice was firm now, steady. "And leave." For a long moment he didn't move. Then finally he reached out and took the ring, his fingers brushing mine for the last time. Felt like the final blow. He clenched his fist around it, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. But it didn't matter anymore. I turned away from him, my veil slipping from my hair as I stepped toward my mother. "I'm done," I whispered. And just like that, my wedding was over. The weight of my decision settled on me as I stepped away from Daniel. No, not Daniel, the man I thought I knew. The cathedral, once filled with joy and anticipation, now felt suffocating. The murmurs of the guests, the rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, the sharp scent of the flowers, it all became a blur. I had walked down this aisle expecting to start a new life. Instead, I was walking back alone. My mother's hand was firm on my arm, guiding me toward the church's entrance. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into myself, but the eyes of every single guest followed me. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others looked on with open pity. And then there were those who just stared like I was the most fascinating disaster they had ever witnessed. As we neared the doors, I heard footsteps behind me. Claire, wait. Him. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Claire, please, Daniel said, his voice raw. Don't do this. Don't let it end like this. I whirled around so fast that my veil fluttered from my hair and hit the ground. My voice was quiet, but the words were like steel. You ended this, Daniel. The second you lied to me. A muscle twitched in his jaw. I was trying to protect you, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. If I had told you the truth, would you have ever given me a chance? I stared at him, my heart aching despite everything. That's not love, I whispered. That's manipulation. His hands balled into fists, his entire body tense. For a moment I saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger but regret. But it was too late for regrets. I turned my back on him for the last time and walked out of the church, into the blinding afternoon sunlight. The second I stepped outside, I yanked off my heels. My feet ached, my body felt like it was made of stone. And my mind was struggling to process what had just happened. I heard my bridesmaids rushing after me, their dresses swishing as they tried to keep up. Claire, are you okay? Rachel, my maid of honor, asked breathlessly. I laughed, an actual laugh. It sounded hollow, a little unhinged. Am I okay? I was about to marry a criminal. I rubbed my hands over my face. No, I'm not okay. Rachel hesitated, then slowly reached for my hand, squeezing it. You're going to be. I wanted to believe her. Somewhere behind me, I heard my mother addressing the guests still inside the church. Thank you all for coming. As you can see, the wedding is cancelled. Please feel free to take some cake on your way out. Cake. A ridiculous, hysterical part of me wanted to go back in and grab a slice. I was still in my wedding dress and I deserved cake, didn't I? I shook my head. I just want to go home, I muttered. My mother appeared beside me, her presence as strong as ever. The car is waiting, she said. Come on, sweetheart. I wanted to argue, to insist that I needed just a moment to breathe, but she wasn't wrong. There was no reason to stay. With one final glance at the church where I was supposed to have the happiest day of my life, I turned away. And I did not look back. The car ride home was silent. My mother sat beside me in the back seat, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Outside the window, the world went on as if nothing had happened. People walked their dogs, cars moved steadily along the streets. The sun continued its slow descent in the sky. I, on the other hand, felt like my world had stopped spinning entirely. I stared at my reflection in the window, my wedding dress still pristine, still beautiful, as if the disaster of the day hadn't touched it. But it was a cruel illusion. The dress was perfect, but I was shattered. I couldn't stop replaying it all in my mind. The moment my mother spoke up. The moment Daniel's face changed, shifting from the man I thought I knew to someone unrecognizable. The way my stomach had dropped when I realized he wasn't denying it. I had stood at the altar with a ghost, a man who didn't even exist. Are you going to say I told you so? I finally asked, breaking the silence. My mother's head turned slightly toward me. No, Claire. I'm not. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Why not? You knew. You tried to warn me. She looked down at her hands. Because I saw the way you looked at him. You loved him. No matter how much I disliked him, I never wanted you to be hurt like this. The words caught me off guard. My mother was not an overly sentimental woman. She was refined, poised, and often harshly honest. But now she just sounded sad. Tears burned in my eyes. I feel so stupid, I whispered. You're not stupid, she said firmly. You believed in someone. That's not a flaw, Claire. That's what makes you human. I turned my gaze back to the window, blinking rapidly. I didn't want to cry. Not yet. Rachel had texted me 3 times since we left the church, asking if I was okay. Other texts had started rolling in too, some from friends, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all suddenly interested in the scandal of my runaway groom who wasn't who he claimed to be. I ignored all of them. When we finally reached my apartment, I hesitated before getting out of the car. I don't know what to do now, I admitted. My mother reached over and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, just as she had when I was a child. You grieve, sweetheart, she said softly, and then you rebuild. I stepped out of the car and walked inside, leaving the chaos of the day behind me. But I knew it wasn't over. Daniel, or whoever he really was, wasn't done yet. And neither was I. The first few days after the wedding were a blur. I barely left my apartment. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, distant relatives, and even some of the wedding guests who suddenly had an interest in my well-being. I ignored most of them. The idea of explaining what had happened, reliving it, felt unbearable. Rachel came by with takeout the next evening, her expression carefully neutral as she handed me a bag of noodles. She didn't press me to talk, didn't offer hollow reassurances that everything would be okay. Instead, she just sat beside me on the couch and turned on a bad reality show. It was exactly what I needed. But the illusion of normalcy didn't last long. 3 days after the wedding, I got a message from an unknown number. Claire, please. Just let me explain. Daniel. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. I should have blocked the number immediately, deleted the message, erased him as thoroughly from my life as I could. Instead, I did something far more reckless. I texted back. Explain what? That you're a liar? That you tricked me into loving someone who doesn't exist? His reply came almost instantly. I never lied about loving you. I swear. Just meet me. One last time. Please. I clenched my phone, my emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to see him, to demand answers, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But the other part of me, the smarter part, knew that seeing him would do nothing but reopen wounds that were already raw. I didn't respond. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. My stomach plummeted. I moved slowly, cautiously toward the peephole. When I looked through it, my breath caught. Daniel stood there. For a moment, I just stared. He looked different, tired, unshaven, like a man unraveling at the seams. He wasn't the polished, confident fiancé I had fallen for. This version of him was frayed, as if his carefully constructed life had finally started to cave in. I hesitated. Then, against every ounce of logic screaming at me to walk away, I opened the door. Claire, he breathed, his eyes searching mine. I folded my arms. You have 5 minutes. He exhaled in relief and stepped inside, but I didn't offer him a seat. I wasn't interested in making him comfortable. I know you hate me, he started. I let out a bitter laugh. Hate doesn't even begin to cover it. He winced. I deserve that. I know I do. But Claire, I didn't do it. I narrowed my eyes. Didn't do what? The embezzlement. The money. I didn't steal it. I scoffed. Then why did you change your name? Why did you disappear? Because I was framed. I froze. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I was working for a firm that was run by corrupt people, Claire. I uncovered what they were doing. How they were moving money illegally, using clients' investments to fund personal accounts. I tried to expose it. But before I could, they pinned it on me and made sure I took the fall. My pulse pounded. You expect me to believe that? I don't expect anything from you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just needed you to know the truth. The truth. I wanted so badly to believe that he was lying again, that this was just another manipulation. But the way he looked at me, so raw, so desperate, made doubt creep into my mind. I had spent the last 3 days convincing myself that the man I had loved was a fraud, that every moment we had shared had been built on deception. But what if it wasn't? And if he was telling the truth? Then I had just walked away from an innocent man. I stared at Daniel, his words settling over me like a storm cloud. Framed. Betrayed. On the run. It sounded like something out of a movie, not the reality of the man I had almost married. You're asking me to believe that you were innocent the whole time? I said slowly. That you ran because you had no other choice? His jaw clenched. I didn't just run, Claire. I survived. If I had stayed, I would have been arrested for something I didn't do. They would have buried me under fabricated evidence. I had no way to prove my innocence. A part of me wanted to push back, to demand why he never confided in me. But another part, the part that still remembered the way he made me laugh, the way he held me when I was scared, whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. But even if he was, it didn't change the most painful fact of all. You still lied to me, I said quietly. Daniel exhaled, his eyes dark with regret. I know. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Silence stretched between us. He stepped closer. Claire, I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief moment, willing myself to remember everything. Not just the love but the deception, the betrayal, the way he had let me stand in front of a church full of people, completely unaware of who he really was. When I opened my eyes, I met his gaze with finality. Maybe you do. But love isn't built on half-truths and hidden pasts. I can't build a life with a man I can't trust. His face crumpled for a split second before he masked it again. Claire. No, I said firmly. This is over. For the first time he truly seemed to accept it. His shoulders sagged. His expression resigned. He nodded once, swallowing hard. Without another word he turned and walked out the door. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had just been. I didn't know if he was guilty or innocent. I didn't know if his past would catch up with him, if he would one day clear his name. But I did know one thing. I deserved a love that didn't come with secrets. And this time I would wait for it.